Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz has no idea how she has come to be on that island. She didn't know that she'd been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean in a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know that she'd been accidentally activated by those curious sea otters. As the robot looked out at the island, it never occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Chapter 11. The Robot Sleeps. Roz stood on the peak and watched the sun sink behind the ocean. She watched shadows slowly spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched the stars come out one by one until the sky was filled with 1,000,000 points of light. It was the first night of the robot's life. She activated her headlights, and suddenly a bright shaft of light was beaming from her eyes and illuminating the whole mountaintop. Too bright. She dimmed them. Then she turned them off and sat in the dark and listened to the chorus of the nighttime chirps. After a while, our robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. So she sat and anchored her hands on the rocks. Her non-essential program switched off, and then, in her own way, the robot slept. Chapter 12. The Storm. Roz felt safe up on the mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low-flying crowd crept up on the mountain, and Roz found herself surrounded by white. When the world faded back into view, she noticed more clouds floating south past the island. Then she heard a deep rumble behind her. The robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with swirling walls of darkness. Light flickered here and there, more deep rumbles. A storm was approaching, and it wasn't just any storm. It was a fierce one that had sent her cargo ship to the floor. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain tapped against the robot. It was time to go. Roz unclamped her hands and began sliding down the peak. Hot sparks flew from where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stone. As soon as her feet hit the soil, she was off and running. The rain fell harder, the wind blew faster, the lightning flashed brighter, the thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling that the rushing rivers of runoff started streaming up everywhere. Roz splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter. But she should have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped, and she tumbled right into a mudslide. Our robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her into rocks and dragging her through brushes, sweeping her straight toward the cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold on to, but the flow only carried her faster to the edge. And just as she was about to plunge over the side, she came to a hard, sudden stop. Mud surged around her, spraying onto her face, pinning her against some solid thing. She blindly felt with her hands and recognized the thick roots of a trunk of a pine tree. In an instant, she was pulling herself up into the branches. The wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard a familiar thunk of the pine cones pelting her body. She didn't even mind them. She was just happy to be safe from that mud flow. The robot locked her arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. Daybreak, and the storm had passed, but the sounds of water were everywhere. The air was filled with dripping sounds of mountain runoff and sloshing sounds of flooded streams. And then came a different sound. It was the clanging sound made when a robot slips on a wet rock. There was quite a few clangs that morning. As Roz worked her way downhill, she scanned the aftermath of the storm. Giant mounds of mud and debris had formed below the cliffs. The island's central river had crested its bank and spilled into the nearby fields and forests. Some trees had been uprooted. Others were submerged, their upper branches barely poking above the floodwaters, their lower branches swarming with fish instead of birds. After such a storm, you might expect to see animal corpses scattered among all the devastation. But the animals seemed to have survived just fine. Somehow they had known the storm was coming, and they had found their shelter long before it rolled in. Lowland creatures who sought refuge on higher ground were waiting patiently for the water to recede. Deer were wading through the flooded fields. Beavers were bustling, collecting a trove of falling branches. Geese honked in the sky before splashing down onto a watery section of forest. Clearly, the animals were experts at survival. Clearly, the robot was not. Roz was crusted with mud and grit, so she gave herself another good cleaning, but that only revealed her dents and scratches. They were really starting to add up. She hardly resembled the perfect robot who had appeared on the shore just a week earlier. The wilderness was taking its toll on poor Roz. So she felt something like relief when she spotted a quiet hole on the side of the mountain. It looked like a safe place for a robot. She stomped across the hillside and up to the cave, but never stopped to wonder what might be lurking inside.